Hey friends, tonight we're stepping through iron gates and into a place where silence was heavier than the stone walls that enclosed it. A place where hunger, discipline, and cold routine shaped every day, the Victorian Workhouse. For the poor, it was not just a building but a sentence. A life stripped of freedom and divided into endless hours of labor, prayer, and silence. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what the weather's like tonight. It's always interesting to see this little community gathered across different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe let the quiet hum of a fan fill the background, and let's begin our slow journey into a year inside the workhouse. The year in the workhouse begins not with celebration, nor with the bright promise of a new calendar, but with the dull weight of another winter pressing down upon stone and body alike. January settles over the building as if it were designed for such weather, cold seeping into every corridor, frost clinging stubbornly to iron railings, and the air filled with that peculiar silence which only the harshest months can bring. From a distance, the workhouse rises like a monument to discipline and necessity, its tall grey walls marking the boundary between two worlds. Beyond them lies the town, where chimneys smoke and people carry on their trades however meagre, while inside the high gates close off a life reduced to bare subsistence, monitored and ordered by rule. The gates themselves are striking, not for beauty, but for severity. Heavy iron, darkened by years of rain and soot, they stand beneath an arch of dressed stone that reveals little of what lies within. When they open, it is with the groan of old hinges, and when they close, the sound carries down the yard like the final word of a sermon. For those entering, whether by choice or coercion, the act of passing through these gates is not easily undone. It is a moment that transforms their place in the community, marking them now as paupers, inmates of the parish institution. On this first day of the year, when frost whitens the cobbles and breath steams in the air, the gates appear even more final, their chill surface a reminder of the permanence of poverty. The workhouse walls stretch long and unbroken, enclosing courtyards that are empty, save for the crunch of boots and the occasional flutter of a bird startled from its perch. Windows, set high and narrow, allow only slivers of light, and even in daylight, much of the interior remains in shadow. The buildings are functional rather than graceful, laid out according to principles of economy and separation. Within these walls, space is divided with a deliberate harshness, one wing for men, another for women, another again for children, each kept apart to prevent familiarity or comfort that might undermine the institution's purpose. In winter, the separation feels even more acute, for the cold exaggerates the stillness, and the echo of distant footsteps reminds all who listen that they are never truly alone, yet rarely together. The yard in January is a desolate place. A thin coating of frost lies over the flagstones, and the shallow puddles have frozen into glassy sheets that glisten faintly in the pale daylight. There is no color here, save the washed-out gray of stone and the dull brown of wooden doors. A pump stands in one corner, its handle stiff with ice, a reminder that water must still be drawn regardless of the weather. Smoke drifts from a chimney or two, carrying the scent of coal and boiled gruel, a smell that will cling to the wards all winter long. It is not unpleasant in itself, but it speaks of monotony, of meals that change little from one day to the next. Inside the gates, time moves differently. The world beyond may be marking New Year's Day with gatherings, with bells in churches, or with the bustle of markets, but the workhouse does not keep such rhythms. Here the day begins early, and proceeds with the measured beat of a timetable that makes no allowance for festivity. The master and matron enforce a routine designed to instill order, and order does not pause for the calendar. Even as frost whitens the fields outside and townsfolk light fires to greet the turning of the year, the workhouse continues as it did yesterday, and as it will tomorrow. One can imagine the soundscape of this place in January. It is not loud, but it is never truly silent either. There is the scraping of boots on stone, the hollow echo of doors shutting, the clang of iron against iron when the gates are drawn. Within the wards, coughs break the stillness, mingled with the faint clatter of utensils, and the whispered shuffle of clothing being moved from one bench to another. On the coldest days, even breath itself seems to linger in the air longer, visible for a moment before it dissolves into the dimness. The absence of laughter or conversation is striking. Speech is restrained, silence enforced, and even when words are exchanged, they carry no warmth of intimacy. January also brings with it a physical discomfort that is inescapable. The workhouse was not built for comfort, and heating is minimal. Fires are lit sparingly, often only in the most necessary rooms, such as the kitchens or infirmary. The wards themselves are left cold, with little more than thin blankets and coarse bedding to shield against the night. The stone floors retain the chill of the season, and many inmates must rise before dawn, when the darkness clings most stubbornly to the sky. Cold hands, stiff with the numbness of sleep, fumble with clothing that offers little insulation, rough uniforms that serve only to distinguish paupers from those outside. From the gates looking inward, the building presents an image of discipline and authority. From within looking outward, the gates form a barrier, both physical and symbolic. Beyond them lies the town, visible perhaps in glimpses, the spire of a church, the tops of houses, a cart rattling down a frosty lane. But such sights are not part of workhouse life. They are fragments of another existence, reminders of a freedom no longer available. The walls and gates exist to make this separation permanent, to remind both inmates and townsfolk alike of the boundary that poverty enforces. Thus January settles heavily upon the workhouse, not merely as a season but as a mood. It is a time when the architecture itself seems to speak of confinement, when the very air carries the weight of discipline. The gates, silent and unyielding, stand as guardians of this world, keeping those within from straying, and those without from seeing too much of what life inside entails. The year may have only just begun, but for those enclosed, it is simply another stretch of days, measured not in celebrations or seasons, but in the sameness of meals, tasks and silence. For those who crossed the threshold into the workhouse, the first experience was not of rest, nor of relief from hunger or exposure, but of ritual humiliation disguised as administrative necessity. Admission day began with a process that was meant to strip away not only dirt and disease, but also dignity and identity, reducing each new arrival to a number, a body, a pauper. On the frost-bitten mornings of January, when families stumbled through the gates with little more than threadbare clothing and the memory of warmer days, this process took on a severity that clung to them long after the moment had passed. The first step was surrender. Upon entry, personal possessions, if any remained, were gathered and taken away. A ragged shawl, a dented spoon, a battered pair of boots, even a child's small toy carved from wood. These objects of individuality were considered unnecessary and potentially contaminating. They would be locked away or destroyed, depending on the judgment of the officials. For those who had clung tightly to the last fragments of their former lives, this removal was devastating. A widow's wedding ring, if she still had it, might be claimed as property of the workhouse. A father's old cap, worn from years of labor, might be cast aside as unfit. What remained was only the self, and even that would be reshaped by the institution. Next came the washing. A bath was mandatory, regardless of the weather. In an era when many of the poor bathed infrequently, the sudden stripping away of clothing and immersion into cold or tepid water was both a physical shock and a moral gesture. Soap, often coarse and harsh, was provided, and the attendants ensured that no dirt remained. The process was not gentle. Those who resisted or hesitated were handled firmly. For women, the loss of hairpins and the scrutiny of matrons was particularly degrading, while men endured their own inspection, sometimes shaved of beards or hair to reduce the risk of lice. Children cried, frightened not only by the unfamiliarity of the moment, but by the sense of being treated like livestock. After washing came the medical inspection. At a time when disease spread quickly in crowded conditions, the workhouse sought to protect itself by ensuring that no inmate brought infection within. The doctor's examination was brisk, clinical, and unembarrassed by modesty. Limbs were checked for sores, scalps for lice, lungs for the rattling sounds of consumption. Those who appeared too ill were directed to the infirmary immediately, where their condition would be managed with minimal care. Others, though weakened by hunger, were deemed fit enough for the general wards. For many, this inspection was as much about classification as about health. One was either able-bodied and therefore fit for labor, or infirm and destined for a different kind of confinement. Once examined, each new inmate was registered. A clerk, seated with ledgers before him, recorded names, ages, occupations and places of birth. The ink scratched across the page, creating an official identity that was both precise and impersonal. For some, this was the first time their existence had been written into a permanent record, yet it brought no sense of pride. Instead, it marked their descent into the category of pauper, no longer a laborer, widow, or child in their own right, but an inmate defined by poverty. Families once listed together in life were divided into separate entries, foreshadowing the physical separation that was soon to come. Then came the issuing of clothing. The workhouse uniform was plain and functional, deliberately so. For men, coarse jackets and trousers, often of rough cloth in muted colors. For women, shapeless gowns of heavy fabric, aprons and caps. For children, smaller versions of the same. There was no allowance for personal preference or comfort. The intention was clear: to erase individuality, to discourage any sense of pride, to make all paupers indistinguishable from one another. The clothing itched, hung awkwardly, and smelled of old storage, yet once donned it marked the wearer as belonging to the institution. Their former clothes, however ragged, were removed and stored away, sometimes burned, leaving nothing of their old identity visible. The psychological effect of this process was profound. To be stripped, washed, examined, recorded, and clothed anew was to undergo a kind of rebirth, but one that led downward rather than upward. It was not a renewal, but a reduction, a deliberate unmaking of the individual. Where once there had been choice, memory, and pride, now there was only the uniformity of pauperdom. The person who entered through the gates was not the same as the one who emerged from admission. That former self, with its stories, its objects and its clothing, was left behind, locked away with the bundle of possessions and the scratch of ink in a ledger. For families, admission day was particularly cruel. Though they may have arrived together, perhaps clinging to one another for comfort against the cold, the process soon tore them apart. Fathers sent one way, mothers another, children divided again still. In some workhouses, siblings might remain together, but often they too were separated, placed into boys' and girls' wards, where they might not see one another for weeks at a time. The cries of children parted from parents echoed down the corridors, only to be met with the stern reminders of attendants that such displays of emotion were improper. Silence was to be kept, even in sorrow, and so by the end of admission day, a newcomer was remade. The gates that closed behind them in the morning now loomed larger in memory, the world outside more distant than ever. Within the wards, beds were assigned, meals distributed, tasks awaited. The cold January air pressed through the windows, but the deeper chill was one of dislocation. A man was no longer a carpenter, but an inmate. A woman was no longer a seamstress, but a pauper. A child was no longer simply a son or daughter, but one of many in the schoolroom of uniform voices. Individuality had been taken, piece by piece, until what remained was the workhouse identity, silent, uniform, obedient and confined. Once the admission process was complete, the newcomers were directed to the spaces they would inhabit, and it was here that the workhouse revealed the depth of its control. The institution was carefully organized to enforce separation and order, not comfort or family cohesion. From the moment one was admitted, the underlying principle was clear. The workhouse existed to regulate, to categorize, to control, and to remove any personal or familial intimacy that might challenge the rigid hierarchy within its walls. The physical layout of the building mirrored this philosophy, with separate wings, corridors, and staircases, designed to ensure that men, women, and children, rarely if ever, encountered one another outside supervised moments. Men were sent to one ward, often located in a section of the building with higher ceilings and narrower windows. These rooms were long and austere, lined with rows of beds, each one assigned with meticulous care. The walls, stone or plaster, retained the chill of winter, and the floors, usually swept but never warmed, radiated cold well into the day. The men were there to labor, to obey, and to exist under constant observation. Interaction was minimal, governed by rules that demanded silence, except when necessary for instruction or work. Laughter, conversation, and camaraderie were discouraged. as they were seen as distractions from duty and potential seeds of disorder. Women were placed in a different part of the building, sometimes mirrored in design but always separate. Their ward was quieter in some ways, the routine more domestic yet equally regimented. Here women scrubbed floors, laundered clothing, sewed uniforms, and performed other tasks deemed suitable for their gender, all under the watchful eye of matrons. Like the men, they were required to maintain silence, to speak only when necessary, and to conduct themselves with a subdued efficiency. Beds were allocated similarly, and the lack of space left little room for privacy. Any sense of sisterhood that might have existed prior to arrival was constrained by the structure of the room, the positioning of furniture, and the rules that demanded constant surveillance. Children were often the most severely affected by separation. They were not merely placed with their parents, but categorized by age and gender. Boys were sent to one wing, girls to another, and younger children might be grouped with infants or toddlers under the care of appointed nurses or older peers assigned to supervision. Schools were established within the workhouse, yet even here, the educational environment was framed by discipline and uniformity, rather than nurturing. Playtime, when allowed, was carefully monitored and limited to prevent gatherings that could evolve into disobedience or disorder. For a child, the first weeks were filled with confusion and fear, as the familiar presence of a parent was replaced by the authority of attendants and teachers. The emotional consequences of this segregation were profound. Families entering together often experienced an immediate sense of loss. A father could watch his wife and children escorted to a separate wing, and feel a quiet despair that was impossible to express as emotion was discouraged and sometimes punished. Mothers could no longer soothe their children's anxieties with touch or warmth beyond what was strictly allowed. Children, seeing parents removed from sight, learned quickly that dependence on family was secondary to obedience within the institution. Affection and attachment, though natural, was subordinated to the operational needs of the workhouse. The very architecture enforced emotional restraint. Corridors, staircases and walls created both a physical and psychological distance that reinforced the rules of detachment. This separation was not merely incidental, it was intentional. Overseers of the workhouse believed that the dissolution of family bonds would prevent favoritism, maintain order, and encourage self-reliance within the parameters of the institution. By fragmenting units that would naturally support one another emotionally, the workhouse could impose authority without question. Observers writing about workhouse life in the Victorian era often commented on the unnatural quiet of the wards, the absence of familial chatter, and the solemnity with which tasks were performed. A young boy who might have clung to a sibling for comfort instead learned to sit alone at meals, complete work without assistance, and face the day's routines with stoic endurance. The spatial organization also reinforced social hierarchies within the workhouse. Elderly or infirm individuals were placed in separate wards, further fragmenting the population. The able-bodied, tasked with labor, rarely had the opportunity to interact meaningfully with those who could not work. In some institutions, these divisions extended even further. Different trades or skill levels might be kept apart, reinforcing the perception that each individual's value was defined solely by their labor capacity. In every aspect, separation was an instrument of control, shaping behavior as surely as meals, clothing, or discipline. Within these divided spaces, the silence became almost tangible. In men's wards, the echo of footsteps on stone floors was met only with the subdued shuffle of laborers at their tasks. In women's wards, the rhythm of scrubbing, sewing, and hauling laundry created a quiet cadence, almost musical in its repetition, yet devoid of laughter or conversation. Children's rooms, filled with the low hum of lessons, felt simultaneously empty and crowded, as the constant presence of authority figures replaced the intimacy of family. The combination of physical separation and enforced silence created an atmosphere in which individuality was continually subordinated to conformity, and any thought of rebellion or personal desire was quietly suppressed. Yet even within these strict divisions, small moments of human connection persisted, though fleeting and muted. A glance exchanged between siblings passing briefly in a corridor, the whisper of a shared understanding between children at play, or the brief conversation permitted during meals could carry the weight of memory and hope. These small acts, though constrained, reminded the inmates that beyond the walls and gates, beyond the frozen yards and stone floors, the human capacity for attachment remained. They were minor concessions, but they persisted in a world designed to erase them. Thus, the rules of segregation and separation were enforced both through architecture and custom, shaping the experience of every day in the workhouse. The high stone walls, the narrow staircases, the separate wings for men, women, children, and infirm, all reinforced a deliberate detachment. Emotional bonds were subordinated to routine, silence, and labor. Every individual who entered the workhouse was reshaped by this environment, learning quickly that survival depended not on family or affection, but on obedience, endurance, and the acceptance of a life defined by separation. The winter of January had ended with admission, but the true weight of the workhouse had only just begun, pressing down upon the newly divided residents as they settled into their assigned wards. As January stretched into the cold midwinter, the men's ward became a world unto itself, a place defined as much by its architecture as by the regimented rhythms imposed upon its inhabitants. Stone floors, perpetually chilled, carried the sound of each footfall with a hollow resonance, amplifying the quiet that filled the long, narrow space. The walls, thick and grey, absorbed little warmth, and the sunlight that occasionally pierced the high, narrow windows fell weakly across benches, beds, and tables, creating long, slanting shadows that shifted imperceptibly over the hours. Inside this environment, life moved slowly, each day unfolding with the mechanical certainty of the workhouse clock, and the men, confined within its rigid routine, were acutely aware of time in a way that was inseparable from labor, silence, and the cold. The morning began before the first hints of light filtered through the frost-smeared windows. Each man rose from his assigned bed, the coarse blanket falling away to reveal thin clothing that did little to combat the chill. The stone beneath their feet was cold enough to seep into the bones, and the breath of the men often formed faint clouds that hovered briefly in the icy air before dissipating. The act of rising was accompanied by a quietness imposed by both habit and authority. Speaking was not forbidden entirely, but the weight of expectation encouraged restraint. The ward itself, long and narrow, was furnished sparingly, rows of wooden beds with thin mattresses, benches for sitting, and perhaps a small table in one corner. Personal space was limited, and the arrangement reinforced both observation and the suppression of individuality. Breakfast, when it arrived, was a modest affair. A thin gruel, sometimes accompanied by a slice of bread, was consumed quickly and silently. Each man knew that lingering too long, or attempting conversation beyond necessity, could draw the attention of the overseer or the master, whose presence was felt even in their absence. Meals were functional rather than pleasurable, intended to sustain rather than to satisfy. They were a reminder that the workhouse existed not to nurture, but to maintain the laboring body at the minimal level required for continued work. The routine of eating, like all other activities, was governed by the clock and by the rules of the institution. Labor was the central element of the men's day. Inside the ward, men might be tasked with repairing tools, mending furniture, or performing other indoor work, but often they were sent into the yard or the stone yard, where physical exertion became both punishment and productivity. Breaking stones, carrying coal, and performing other arduous tasks in the biting winter air tested the body's limits. These activities were designed to occupy time, deter idleness, and instill a sense of obedience through controlled exertion. The work was repetitive, mechanical, and often monotonous, but it was enforced with strict attention to order and compliance. Any hesitation or apparent lack of effort could result in censure, extra labor, or other forms of discipline. Even within the ward, the men were subject to observation. Attendants, usually younger or less infirm men appointed by the master, walked the aisles, noting posture, movement, and the subtle signs of rebellion or fatigue. Silence was enforced, and gestures of camaraderie were curtailed. If a man attempted to speak without necessity, he might be reminded sharply of the rules, the words echoing along the stone walls and reinforcing the pervasive authority. Every action, from the way a man made his bed to the pace at which he dressed, was subtly scrutinized. The psychological effect was cumulative. Day after day, the men learned to suppress complaints, to limit expression, and to internalize the rigid hierarchy of the workhouse. The cold, particularly in January, amplified the discomfort and monotony. Fires were minimal, and often restricted to a small area, leaving much of the ward in a state of persistent chill. The men's coarse uniforms offered little warmth, and blankets were thin and shared. Even the act of moving about the ward required endurance, as the stone floors transmitted the cold, and made every step a reminder of their constrained circumstances. The long hours spent idle, or performing labor indoors were punctuated only by meals and occasional brief instructions, yet the sense of time dragging was magnified by the uniformity of action and the sameness of surroundings. The workhouse also imposed a hierarchy within the men themselves. Those who were assigned as attendants, monitors, or senior laborers carried additional responsibility, and this could alter the experience of the day. They moved among their peers with a measure of authority, enforcing rules and reporting infractions. In doing so, they became instruments of the system, further embedding the pervasive control of the institution into the daily lives of the men. For the others, observing this hierarchy reinforced the lesson that obedience was rewarded and deviation punished, a lesson that shaped not only their behavior within the ward, but their perception of self and survival within the workhouse. Sleep, when it came at night, offered little relief. The cold persisted, seeping into bones and mattresses alike. The beds, arranged in long rows, allowed minimal space, and the presence of so many bodies in close proximity brought both warmth and discomfort. Snoring, coughing, and the shifting of limbs punctuated the night, yet the enforced quiet and the anticipation of dawn limited relaxation. Even in sleep, the men remained bound to the rhythm of the workhouse, their bodies and minds conditioned by the cold, the labor, and the silent expectation of obedience. Through these long winter days, the men's ward became a study in endurance. The combination of physical discomfort, regimented labor, minimal nourishment, and constant supervision created an atmosphere that was both oppressive and formative. Each day mirrored the last, a repetition intended to break resistance and instill conformity. Outside, January continued its slow icy advance, but inside, the days moved according to the immutable clock of the workhouse. Rise, labor, eat, labor, rest, repeat. The monotony was itself a tool, reinforcing both the authority of the institution and the subdued compliance of those within. By the end of a winter's day, the men were not merely fatigued from labor. They were subdued, shaped by the physical environment, by silence, and by the demands placed upon them. Their bodies, hands, and voices had been regulated, and the ward itself had done its work, reinforcing the lessons, first imparted at admission, that the workhouse was a world apart, governed by routine, discipline, and an unyielding separation from the freedom and warmth beyond its stone walls. While the men faced the stone floors and bitter cold of the external yard, the women inhabited a different realm within the same austere walls, a space defined less by open labor, and more by repetition, precision, and supervision. The women's ward, usually situated in a separate wing, echoed with a quieter rhythm, though no less oppressive. Here the days unfolded in a carefully choreographed routine of domestic work, endless sewing, ceaseless laundry, and the perpetual scrubbing of floors, walls, and utensils, tasks designed to instill discipline, prevent idleness, and occupy the hands and minds of those who might otherwise dwell upon misfortune. The architecture of the ward itself reinforced its purpose. Rows of beds lined the walls, each assigned to a woman, with little room for movement between them. The floor, often wooden, creaked beneath the weight of footsteps and the movement of furniture, amplifying the sense of watchfulness. Windows, narrow and positioned high, let in only the pale winter light, leaving most of the space in shadow. A central area or long table served as both workspace and passageway, ensuring that every action was observable. From the earliest moments of the day, women were expected to begin their work, often before dawn, and to continue with minimal interruption until the evening, when exhaustion, rather than comfort, dictated the slowing of motion. Sewing occupied a large portion of the day. Coarse cloth, uniforms for the workhouse or for parish use, and occasional mending for the better off were distributed according to need. Women bent over their tasks, needles passing in and out of thick fabric with precision and speed, eyes straining in the dim light. Each stitch was a measure of obedience. Each uniform completed a small testament to endurance within the constraints of the institution. The repetitive motion dulled both body and thought, yet the work was never entirely silent. The soft puncturing of cloth and the rustle of movement were constant companions in the otherwise quiet space. Laundry work was no less demanding. Large tubs of water, heated over central fires, required lifting, soaking, scrubbing, and rinsing. Heavy irons, blackened from repeated use, pressed damp cloth into conformity, while sheets, gowns, and undergarments were hung to dry in makeshift lines, filling the ward with the faint scent of wet fabric and soap. The work was physically taxing, especially in the winter months when the air inside the building remained cold and damp, seeping through clothing and chilling the skin. Hands became red and cracked from water and soap, muscles ached from repetitive motion, and the hours stretched endlessly as the tasks cycled without variation. Scrubbing floors was equally relentless. Using stiff brushes and coarse solutions, women scoured every stone or wooden surface, often moving in unison under the strict supervision of the matron. Floors that gleamed in the morning would be dull by nightfall, worn down by continuous work. Walls were scrubbed, windows cleaned, and fireplaces tended, all within a framework that demanded efficiency and minimized error. The tasks were designed to occupy both body and mind, leaving little room for reflection, conversation, or dissent. Any pause, any attempt to divert attention, was noticed and corrected, the matron's presence a constant reminder of authority. The matron herself was both guardian and enforcer. Often an older woman, experienced in the ways of the institution, she moved through the ward with quiet authority, eyes noting posture, movement, and attention to duty. Her presence was never oppressive in a loud or violent sense, but it was pervasive. Her attention extended across the rows of women, a subtle but unyielding pressure to conform. The women quickly learned to anticipate observation, to regulate speech, and to maintain a disciplined approach to labor. Even minor mistakes could draw a reprimand, not necessarily harsh, but enough to reinforce the hierarchy and the rules that governed life within the ward. Silence was an unspoken law. Conversation, when it occurred, was muted and functional, limited to the exchange of instructions or clarification of a task. Laughter, gossip, and personal talk were discouraged, viewed as distractions or even potential threats to order. The ward, despite its domestic work, felt less intimate than the home environments many of the women might have known. Relationships and bonds were necessarily superficial, fleeting, and often constrained to the briefest moments of shared understanding. In a space designed to suppress individual identity, every smile, glance, or whispered word was a subtle act of quiet defiance, though it was one performed with caution. Meals punctuated the day with their own rhythms, yet they were no more comforting than labor. Gruel, bread, and the occasional meat or vegetable were distributed in silence, often eaten quickly at long communal tables. Women returned to work afterward, their bodies tired but their attention required to maintain the pace and precision expected by the matron and by the institution. Any attempt to linger or rest beyond what was allowed could invite admonishment or even extra work, reinforcing the notion that every moment in the workhouse was accounted for and regulated. Winter compounded the physical challenges. Fires, while maintained in central areas, were sparse, leaving much of the ward damp and cold. Clothing was coarse and offered limited protection against the chill, and blankets were thin and shared. Even as women moved from one task to another, the cold clung to hands and joints, stiffening muscles and slowing motion, yet it could not halt the unbroken cycle of labor. The day proceeded with deliberate monotony, and the clock of the institution governed all aspects of existence: wake, work, meal, work, rest, and repeat. In these long repetitive hours, the women were reshaped as surely as in the men's ward. Their identities were subordinated to the institution's needs, their individuality masked by uniform clothing and regulated behavior. Yet subtle forms of endurance persisted. A stitch taken with care, a momentary glance exchanged with another, a quiet sigh of shared fatigue. These small acts, though private and constrained, served as reminders that even within the rigid framework of the workhouse, humanity persisted. Thus, The women's ward in winter was a world of labor, silence and observation. The endless cycle of sewing, scrubbing and laundry, punctuated by the matron's watchful gaze and the cold that seeped into stone and bone alike, defined the day. It was a space where survival depended on endurance, obedience, and the quiet acceptance of monotony. And yet within these harsh confines the subtle persistence of personal resilience flickered, small but unmistakable, a quiet testament to life continuing, even under the strictest regimen. While men and women endured labor and routine in their respective wings, the children of the workhouse inhabited a world both smaller and stricter, one defined by rules, instruction and constant supervision. The children's ward was a place where youth, innocence and curiosity were subordinated to the mechanical rhythms of the institution, where every hour was scheduled and every action guided by authority. In the frozen months of winter, this environment was amplified in its austerity. The stone floors or wooden planks were cold beneath small feet, and the narrow windows allowed only the pale light of day to filter through, leaving the ward often dim and shadowed. Within these walls, the world of childhood was reduced to a series of routines designed to educate, discipline, and regulate behavior. Morning began early, sometimes before the sun had risen, with children roused from thin mattresses on rows of wooden beds. The blankets were coarse, the bedding sparse, and the chill of the season clung to their limbs, even after they had dressed in uniforms of rough cloth. Each child knew that personal comfort was secondary to the demands of the workhouse, and the very act of rising was infused with the expectation of obedience. Noise was minimized, even in these early moments. A cough or a stumble could draw the attention of attendants, who moved quietly among the rows of children, ensuring that discipline was maintained. Breakfast was simple and functional. Thin porridge, occasionally with a small piece of bread or a measure of gruel, provided the minimum nourishment necessary to sustain the body through long hours of activity. The children ate quickly and quietly, with attention focused more on consumption than on enjoyment. Conversation was limited. When words were exchanged, they were cautious, measured, and rarely personal. The meal itself was an exercise in conformity, a first step in preparing children to inhabit a world in which individuality was constrained by rules, observation, and the demands of survival. Education within the workhouse was not intended to inspire curiosity or imagination, but to instill obedience, literacy, and basic arithmetic, practical skills that could prepare children for labor in adulthood. Lessons were conducted in a designated room or section of the ward, with rows of small desks or benches arranged in strict order. Teachers or appointed attendants delivered instruction in reading, writing, and numeracy, moving among the children to correct mistakes and maintain attention. Mistakes were met with quiet admonishment, not encouragement. Praise was measured and functional. The emphasis was on precision, repetition, and the ability to follow direction, reflecting the institution's broader philosophy of control and utility. Prayers punctuated the day, often delivered in the form of silent reflection or communal recitation. Religious instruction reinforced moral conduct and obedience, shaping children to understand their place within the hierarchy of the workhouse. These moments, though brief, were enforced rigorously, with rows of children standing or kneeling in formation, their small bodies rigid and attentive. The act of prayer, like the lessons, was less about spiritual reflection than about conformity, a repetition of words, a performance of piety, a measure of discipline, internalized through ritual. Physical labor, though lighter than that required of adults, occupied much of the children's time. Tasks included cleaning, carrying supplies, assisting with laundry, or preparing simple meals under supervision. These duties, often repetitive and tiring, introduced the young to the rhythms of work and obedience, serving as preparation for the tasks they would eventually undertake as adults. Winter compounded the difficulty. Cold air and frozen surfaces made movement uncomfortable, and the warmth of fires was limited, leaving small hands and feet perpetually chilled. Fatigue settled quickly, yet the schedule allowed little room for rest beyond what was strictly permitted. Meals, instruction, labor, and prayer followed one another with unyielding regularity. Any deviation from the schedule, any act of inattention, could result in reprimand or isolation, subtle methods of enforcing control and compliance. Even in moments that might otherwise permit play or interaction, the children's world remained circumscribed, Interaction was allowed but structured, and affection, while natural, was often restrained by the presence of authority figures. Emotional expression was contained. Tears might be met with quiet admonishment, laughter limited to brief and supervised interludes. Sleep at the end of the day was similarly regulated. Children returned to their assigned beds, arranged in rows that allowed little privacy, under thin blankets that offered minimal protection from the cold. The quiet of night was not only a natural consequence of the hour, but a continuation of the broader atmosphere of control that governed every aspect of workhouse life. Even in rest, bodies and minds were conditioned to the schedule and authority that defined waking hours, the constant rhythm of obedience carried into dreams. The psychological impact of this regimented existence was profound. Children learned quickly that survival depended upon compliance, that comfort and familiarity were rare luxuries, and that the world within the workhouse operated according to rules, separate from those of family or home. The enforced separation from parents and siblings, the relentless cycle of instruction and labor, and the suppression of spontaneous expression created a landscape in which childhood itself was narrowed to the essentials of endurance, learning and obedience. Yet, within these harsh parameters, faint traces of normalcy persisted. Small friendships were formed, shared understanding, exchanged in brief glances or whispered words. A favorite lesson, a small success in arithmetic, or a momentary triumph in labor could bring a quiet satisfaction, though always framed by the constraints of the ward. These subtle markers of resilience persisted as reminders that even within a tightly controlled environment, the impulses of human development and social connection remained alive, if constrained. Thus, the children's ward in winter was a microcosm of the broader workhouse, a place of order, repetition and regulated life, where comfort, freedom and familial warmth were subordinated to the demands of discipline. Days were measured in lessons, labor and prayer, punctuated by the minimal nourishment required to sustain body and mind. Outside, the frost of January pressed against the walls. Inside, a colder rhythm prevailed, shaping the young inhabitants into figures molded by necessity, obedience, and the enduring, if restrained, persistence of youthful resilience. In the Victorian workhouse, sustenance was not a matter of comfort, taste, or choice. It was a matter of survival, rationed with meticulous care and administered with strict discipline. The provision of food followed both practical and moral objectives to sustain the body sufficiently for labor, to prevent indulgence, and to reinforce the hierarchy of authority within the institution. For those confined within the high stone walls, the daily ritual of eating was both a physical necessity and a symbolic reminder of their position in a world defined by poverty and regulation. Mornings typically began with a thin gruel, a watery mixture of oatmeal or other grains boiled into a bland consistency. The aroma, faint and earthy, hung over the tables as inmates shuffled to their assigned benches, trays in hand. The gruel was lukewarm, sometimes slightly scalding, and offered minimal flavor. Children, men and women alike ate quickly, aware that lingering or idle chatter could draw the attention of overseers. The texture was uniform and unyielding, a liquid reminder of the workhouse's purpose, nourishment without pleasure. A small slice of bread, dense and slightly sour, often accompanied the gruel, providing additional sustenance yet doing little to counter the monotony of the meal. Midday brought a meal slightly more substantial, often consisting of potatoes boiled or roasted, sometimes accompanied by cabbage or other inexpensive vegetables. Meat was rare, reserved for special occasions or distributed sparingly to supplement the otherwise monotonous diet. The cooking was performed by a separate department or by selected inmates under supervision, and the food, once prepared, was carried in trays to the long dining halls or common rooms. Here, silence was enforced with the same diligence as in labor or instruction. Speaking was minimal, laughter discouraged, and gestures of intimacy rare. Eating was a solitary act in the midst of a crowd, the focus entirely on the consumption of nourishment rather than social engagement or pleasure. The ritual of meals extended beyond the mere act of eating. Seating was regimented, often arranged according to age, gender, or status within the workhouse hierarchy. Each inmate had a specific place, a tray or bowl assigned, and a defined portion determined by overseers or calculated according to rules designed to ration the scarce resources carefully. The act of queuing for food, receiving it under watchful eyes, and returning to one's place reinforced the omnipresent authority of the institution. Every aspect of the meal, from the distribution of bread to the clearing of plates, was conducted according to the clock and rules, leaving little room for spontaneity or comfort. The texture and taste of the food were consistently utilitarian. Gruel, thin and often lumpy, required careful swallowing to avoid choking or unpleasant sensations. Bread, dense and sometimes stale, filled the stomach without providing the satisfaction of flavor. Potatoes, boiled until soft and sometimes overcooked, offered minimal variation, even when meat appeared, a small piece of salted beef or a rare portion of mutton. It was modest and served without seasoning beyond the barest necessities. Sweetness was almost entirely absent. Sugar, fruit, and other luxuries were forbidden, except on rare occasions, leaving a diet that was monotonous and austere. Meals were also a measure of obedience. Children were expected to consume what was given without complaint. Adults were reminded that grumbling was both unseemly and potentially punishable. Any leftover food was rarely permitted to remain. It was either collected, redistributed, or discarded according to institutional rules. The pace of consumption was monitored. Slow eaters, or those who lingered beyond the permitted time, might be observed, their behavior noted for future correction. The combination of scarcity, repetition, and surveillance created a ritual in which eating itself became an exercise in discipline, endurance, and compliance. The sensory experience of the workhouse meal was uniform and unvarying. The faint smell of boiled grains, the muted aroma of potatoes and cabbage, and the occasional scent of meat mingled in the cold, stone-floored halls. Wooden benches, long tables, and hard chairs offered little comfort. The echoes of shuffling feet, the scrape of utensils against bowls, and the faint hum of silence composed an auditory landscape that was simultaneously communal and isolating. Even in proximity to others, each inmate's experience of the meal remained intensely personal, constrained by both the simplicity of the food and the rules governing its consumption. Food also carried symbolic weight. Each serving was a reminder of the workhouse's philosophy: sufficiency without indulgence, nourishment as a right only within the bounds of obedience, and the absolute authority of the institution over the bodies of those within it. To eat was to submit, to accept one's position in the hierarchy, and to participate in the broader structure of labor and regulation. Meals, therefore, were as much about psychological conditioning as they were about physical sustenance, embedding the lessons of humility, endurance, and conformity into the daily routine. Evenings followed similar patterns. Supper, like breakfast and lunch, was simple, functional, and administered under close supervision. The repetition of meals, day after day, week after week, reinforced both the physical monotony of workhouse life and the mental rhythm of obedience. The cold, damp stone halls, the silence, and the uniformity of food and portion combined to create an environment in which comfort was scarce, individuality minimized, and the day's rhythm dictated entirely by the institution. For many inmates, meals were also moments of reflection, brief periods in which hunger, fatigue, and awareness of the surrounding hierarchy coalesced into quiet introspection. Children might glance toward the empty spaces where parents should have been. Men might note the faces of peers enduring the same limitations. Women might observe the matron's constant presence even during consumption. The combination of scarcity, repetition, and regulation made meals both a necessity and a meditation on the constraints of life within the workhouse walls. In this way, food, though meager, became a central thread in the tapestry of daily existence. It marked the passage of time, structured the day, and reinforced the authority and purpose of the institution. Gruel, bread, potatoes, and the rare slice of meat were never merely sustenance. They were instruments of control, symbols of a life defined by constraint, and constant reminders that survival within the workhouse required both physical endurance and psychological submission. Beyond the walls and warmth, or what passed for warmth, of the men's ward, winter's chill extended into the stone yard, a bleak expanse of gravel, cobblestones, and open sky where the workhouse imposed some of its most grueling labor. The stone yard was a place of relentless monotony and physical exertion, where men, under close supervision, engaged in tasks designed to occupy the body, regulate the mind, and instill a sense of endurance and obedience. Here, work was punishment, deterrent, and routine, all folded into one, and every movement was measured against the unyielding expectation of discipline. The primary task was the breaking of stones, a labor that demanded both strength and patience. Men wielded heavy hammers to crush cobbles or larger rocks into gravel, which would then be used for road maintenance, paving, or other public works. The repetitive motion of lifting, striking, and repositioning stones created a rhythm that was both exhausting and hypnotic. Arms ached, backs stiffened, and fingers blistered, yet the day continued without pause, the cycle repeating from dawn to dusk. The monotony was intentional. The workhouse masters believed that tedious labor would occupy the mind, leaving little room for complaint, reflection, or rebellion. Oakum picking was another frequent task, often performed alongside stone breaking or for those deemed less physically capable. Men unpicked old ropes into loose fibers, a job requiring patience, attention, and careful fingers. The process was slow, repetitive, and quiet, contrasting with the physical strain of lifting stones, yet equally designed to instill endurance. The unrelenting nature of the work, whether heavy or delicate, enforced a psychological conditioning, the understanding that time within the workhouse was measured, not in hours or minutes, but in tasks, repetitions, and the silent acceptance of monotony. The stone yard itself amplified the harshness of winter. The cold penetrated thick clothing and settled in muscles already fatigued from labor. Snow, frost, and icy wind rendered the work more physically taxing. Damp gloves and frozen hands made gripping hammers or manipulating ropes an exercise in perseverance. The open expanse offered no respite from the weather. Shelter was minimal, and the constant exposure reminded men that their comfort was secondary to the institution's purpose. Even brief pauses were discouraged, as overseers patrolled the yard, ensuring that each man maintained pace and complied with rules. Labor in the stone yard was both punishment and deterrent. For the able-bodied, idleness was considered dangerous, a threat to order and authority. The workhouse masters believed that enforcing physically demanding and monotonous tasks would break spirit, prevent rebellion, and prepare men for the labor expected of them outside the institution. Mistakes, pauses, or signs of fatigue could invite reprimand, additional tasks, or subtle punishment, reinforcing the understanding that survival and favor within the workhouse depended on compliance, endurance, and the willingness to subject oneself to continual exertion. Despite the apparent simplicity of the tasks, the stone yard imposed a psychological weight that matched its physical demands. Each blow of the hammer, each fiber unraveled, each repetition of the day's work was a reminder of confinement, authority, and routine. Time seemed to stretch interminably, measured not in hours but in the rhythm of labor. The uniformity of movement and sound, the striking of stone, the tearing of rope fibers, the shuffle of feet on gravel, created an auditory landscape that was both oppressive and hypnotic, embedding the lessons of endurance and obedience deep into the daily experience. Men learned quickly to anticipate supervision. Overseers, often armed with the authority of the master, moved through the yard with a quiet vigilance, eyes scanning for mistakes or hesitation. Their presence was constant but rarely intrusive in voice. The threat of observation itself was enough to maintain order. The workhouse relied on this combination of physical exertion and psychological control to shape behavior, ensuring that men internalized the rules, minimized resistance, and accepted the harsh routine as an inescapable reality. Breaks, when allowed, were brief and functional, designed solely to permit minimal rest or the consumption of the next ration of food. There was no opportunity for socializing or casual conversation. Even moments of respite were measured, controlled, and limited. The cold, combined with exhaustion and the monotony of the work, created a sense of time dragging yet days merging into one another, a continuous cycle of effort, observation, and endurance. At the end of each day, the men returned to the warmth, or the illusion of warmth, within the stone walls of the ward. Their bodies were tired, their hands calloused, and their spirits shaped by the unbroken repetition of labor. The stone yard, with its biting cold, monotonous tasks and constant oversight, had accomplished its purpose, breaking both body and mind into patterns of endurance, obedience, and acceptance. The lessons of the day extended beyond physical exertion. They were lessons in hierarchy, regulation, and the limits of personal comfort within the rigid world of the workhouse. In this way, the stone yard was both a site of punishment and a tool for institutional control. Each man's labor contributed to public works or the internal maintenance of the workhouse, but it was also a constant reminder of the omnipresent authority, the necessity of endurance, and the monotony that defined every day in this shadowed, cold, and relentless world. By the time the winter sun had set, and the men trudged back to their stone-floored ward, the day's labor had imprinted itself in muscle, bone, and mind, a quiet testament to the power of routine toil and the unyielding hand of the institution. While the men labored in the stone yard, often exposed to winter's harsh winds and the biting cold, the women endured an equally relentless regimen within the confines of the workhouse laundry, a place defined by steam, moisture, and the ceaseless rhythm of domestic toil. The laundry was both a workspace and an instrument of control, where repetitive labor and physical exertion combined to structure time, discipline behavior, and reinforce the hierarchy of authority. Within these walls, the cold of winter was mitigated only slightly by the heat of boiling water and the central fire, but the damp, heavy air carried its own discomfort, chilling skin as soon as hands emerged from tubs or work shifted to ironing boards. Mornings in the laundry began with the preparation of materials. Large copper or iron tubs were filled with water, which was heated over fires to the highest temperature deemed safe for the clothing to be washed. Women carried, lifted, and stirred heavy bundles of linen, uniforms, and occasionally parish clothing, their hands immersed in water that was alternately scalding and chilling, as the air itself offered little warmth. Each piece of clothing required scrubbing, often with coarse brushes or soap, to remove the stains of previous labor, the grime of hands, or the general dirt of the workhouse's daily life. The repetitive nature of the task quickly shaped both posture and movement, each motion measured and habitual, the body trained to endure long hours with little variation. Ironing presented its own challenges. Heavy irons, heated over open flames, were lifted and pressed onto damp linen with precision and force. The women's arms and shoulders ached from the constant motion, and the heat of the irons contrasted sharply with the chill of the stone floor and winter air. Each garment had to be smoothed, folded, and set aside in stacks, ready for redistribution within the workhouse or delivery to the parish. Mistakes, wrinkles, or insufficient effort could be noted by the matron or overseer, leading to reprimand or additional labor, reinforcing the underlying lesson that attention to detail and obedience were as essential as physical endurance. The repetition was unending. Bundles arrived continually, the rhythm of scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, and ironing repeating for hours without interruption. Conversation was minimal, largely functional, and heavily constrained by the matron's watchful gaze. Laughter, casual interaction, or expression of frustration was discouraged. The air filled instead with the hissing of steam, the splash of water, and the repetitive sounds of hands, brushes, and irons moving in unbroken sequence. The monotony was both punishment and training, teaching women to accept labor without complaint, and to internalize the rules and hierarchy of the workhouse. Physical strain was compounded by the environment. Floors, often wooden or stone, became wet and slippery, increasing the risk of minor injury or discomfort. Steam, while offering some warmth, condensed into droplets on the walls and ceilings, creating a damp chill that penetrated clothing and skin alike. The repetitive bending, lifting, and stretching required by laundry tasks left muscles sore, joints stiff, and hands raw from soap, water, and friction. Every motion reinforced the knowledge that endurance was not optional, that comfort was minimal, and that the cycle of labor would continue for as long as the workhouse required. The laundry also served as a psychological instrument. The constant supervision, the unbroken cycle of tasks, and the relentless demand for precision reinforced the authority of the matron and the broader institution. Women learned quickly that errors, delays, or inattentiveness were noted and sometimes punished. Even small successes, such as neatly folded garments or a stack of linen completed ahead of schedule, were subsumed into the routine of labor, acknowledged only in the sense that they allowed continuation without reprimand. The environment left little space for individuality. Identity became intertwined with the capacity to endure, comply, and complete the next task in the endless sequence. Meals punctuated the day, offering only brief respite. Even while consuming food, the women's minds were often still attuned to the labor awaiting them, the next bundle to be scrubbed, or the looming presence of the matron. Winter intensified the physical demands, hands chilled by water, muscles stiffened by cold, and the air, heavy with steam, offered only fleeting warmth. The monotony, physical discomfort, and unrelenting schedule combined to create a sensory experience both oppressive and hypnotic, each day blending seamlessly into the next. By evening, exhaustion settled into the women's bodies. Hands ached, shoulders and backs throbbed, and fingers were raw from contact with water and soap. Yet the laundry remained orderly, clean and stacked, a visible manifestation of both labor and control. In the brief moments before sleep, women might reflect quietly on the day, noting their fatigue, the monotony, or the small acts of endurance that had carried them through. Even within the austere and controlled environment, resilience persisted, though it was muted, private, and always subject to the scrutiny of authority. In this way, the workhouse laundry exemplified the broader philosophy of Victorian institutional life: labor as control, repetition as discipline, and physical exertion as a tool to structure time and suppress dissent. The women who labored there were molded by the rhythm of the day, the cold, the steam, and the unceasing demands of washing, scrubbing, and ironing, their existence defined by endurance, obedience, and the quiet persistence of human resilience under relentless conditions. Within the austere confines of the workhouse, children's education was not a pursuit of curiosity, imagination, or exploration, but a carefully regulated process aimed at instilling obedience, literacy, and moral compliance. The classroom was a space of quiet repetition and discipline, often segregated by age and gender, designed to shape young minds according to the institutional philosophy that knowledge, when paired with strict adherence to rules, could produce competent, submissive adults capable of labor and service. The room itself was functional and stark. Rows of wooden desks or benches were arranged with precision, each child assigned a specific seat. Walls were bare, save for the occasional chart, displaying the alphabet, multiplication tables, or religious instruction, and windows were narrow, admitting only the pale light of winter, which filtered through frost-laced glass. The chill of the season penetrated the stone or wooden floors, leaving children shivering despite the layers of coarse clothing they wore. Fires, when present, were small and positioned to benefit only a portion of the room, forcing many to endure the cold while attention remained fixed on lessons. Instruction was conducted by an appointed teacher or senior inmate, whose role was both instructor and enforcer. Lessons began promptly, often after prayers or ritual acknowledgement of authority. Children were required to memorize passages from the catechism, practice reading aloud, and perform arithmetic exercises repeatedly. Mistakes were corrected immediately. Hesitation, distraction, or inattentiveness could provoke reprimand. The emphasis was on rote memorization rather than understanding or personal engagement. Letters, numbers, and religious passages were drilled into memory through repetition, voice, and occasional physical prompts, reinforcing the expectation of compliance and concentration under supervision. Discipline permeated every aspect of the classroom. Movement was limited. Children were expected to maintain posture and remain attentive, even when cold, hungry, or fatigued. Silence was enforced, and conversations, if permitted at all, were brief and functional. Minor infractions, slouching, whispering, or failing to recite a passage correctly, could result in isolation, additional work, or a formal admonition. Authority was omnipresent, both in the form of the instructor's watchful eyes and the institutional rules that governed every action, ensuring that children understood the consequences of deviation from expected behavior. The content of instruction reflected the priorities of the workhouse. Literacy and numeracy were emphasized for practical purposes, equipping children with skills necessary for basic labor, clerical work, or service in households. Religious education, through catechism and prayer, reinforced moral conduct, humility, and acceptance of hierarchy. Lessons were not intended to spark inquiry or creativity, but to instill habits of obedience, attention, and endurance. Every recitation, exercise, and written passage was a measure not only of intellectual ability, but of compliance with institutional expectations. The physical environment of the classroom amplified the challenges of learning. Cold air and damp floors sapped energy and focus, while the constant observation of authority figures created subtle psychological pressure. Children learned quickly that survival and relative comfort within the workhouse depended on concentration, obedience, and conformity to expectations. Success was measured not in achievement or personal growth, but in the ability to perform tasks correctly, maintain silence, and meet the precise demands of teachers and overseers. Meals and breaks punctuated the school day, though they were brief and regimented. The return to work or lessons after consumption of simple porridge or bread reinforced the cyclical nature of life in the workhouse, a rhythm of labor, instruction, and observation that left little room for spontaneous thought, play, or personal expression. Even moments of accomplishment were framed within the context of routine. A correctly recited passage or completed arithmetic exercise was acknowledged, but only as a continuation of expected performance, never as an opportunity for celebration or reflection. The psychological impact of this structured education was profound. Children were taught early to associate compliance with approval and deviation with consequence, to regulate behavior according to external authority, and to internalize the values of discipline and endurance. Friendships, shared understanding, or subtle rebellion were constrained by observation, rules, and the awareness that individuality could not supersede institutional expectations. Even small acts of creativity, curiosity, or humor were fleeting, contained, and often suppressed. Over weeks and months, the routine of schooling, coupled with the labor, meals, and regimented life in the workhouse, shaped children's perception of the world. The repetition of instruction, the cold, the monotony, and the ever-present authority created a psychological framework in which endurance, obedience, and utility were paramount. Childhood, as experienced within these walls, was narrowly defined, a period in which mind and body were molded by institution, repetition, and regulation, preparing each child for the austere life that awaited beyond or within continued workhouse confinement. Thus, schooling in the workhouse was more than an educational process. It was an instrument of social conditioning. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and catechism became the medium through which obedience and endurance were taught, each day reinforcing the lessons of hierarchy, submission, and the endurance of monotony. Within the quiet, cold, and repetitive environment of the classroom, children learned not only letters and numbers, but the broader truths of workhouse life, that existence was structured, comfort was minimal, and survival depended upon strict adherence to the rules imposed by authority. Life within the workhouse was governed not merely by the daily routines of labor, meals, and schooling, but by a constant framework of inspection, observation, and regulation. Central to this framework were the master and matron, whose presence and authority permeated every corner of the institution, ensuring that the rules were obeyed, order maintained, and the moral and physical discipline of inmates enforced. The workhouse was as much an environment of surveillance as it was of sustenance, and the awareness of this oversight shaped behavior, posture, and even thought. Inspections were regular and methodical. The master, sometimes accompanied by the matron or senior staff, would move through wards, dormitories, and workrooms, scrutinizing cleanliness, posture, and conduct. Floors were checked for dust and dirt, beds were inspected for neatness, clothing and uniforms were examined for wear or misalignment. Children's desks and lesson materials were assessed for orderliness, while women's laundry and men's labor outputs were evaluated against institutional standards. Every detail was observed, every deviation noted, and any lapse could result in correction, additional labor, or, in more severe cases, formal admonishment. The physical act of inspection was quiet, but authoritative, a reminder that nothing within the workhouse escaped the gaze of those in power. Rules were equally pervasive, their enforcement, both formal and informal. Silence, cleanliness, punctuality, and attention to duty were emphasized continually. Speaking without permission, failing to complete assigned work, or showing hesitation or fatigue was considered a violation of the institution's expectations. Inmates were reminded daily that personal comfort, choice or indulgence was subordinate to the needs of the community, the authority of the master, and the broader philosophy of workhouse life. Rules were not suggestions, they were absolute, extending to every action, posture, and utterance. Regular readings of the rules reinforced their importance. At appointed times, inmates might be gathered to hear the rules recited aloud, often by the master, matron, or an appointed attendant. These readings were precise and deliberate, emphasizing obedience, propriety, and the consequences of disobedience. Children, for instance, were instructed to maintain silence, focus on lessons, and respect authority figures, while adults were reminded of expectations regarding labor, cleanliness, and conduct. The words, repeated week after week, functioned as both instruction and warning, a constant auditory reminder of the boundaries within which life in the workhouse existed. Beyond verbal instruction, physical inspections reinforced compliance. Beds had to be made uniformly, clothing folded or worn correctly, tools and work materials arranged according to specific standards. The slightest irregularity could attract attention, whether a crooked shirt, a dusty floor, or a misaligned desk. In this environment, attention to detail was not merely encouraged but demanded, and the act of inspection itself became an instrument of psychological conditioning, training inmates to anticipate scrutiny and internalize the institution's expectations. Morality, too, was a matter of oversight. All workhouse authorities monitored behavior, not only for physical order, but for adherence to prescribed moral codes. Gossip, quarrels, displays of anger, or any action deemed frivolous or improper, could prompt correction. Children were observed for manners, attention in school, and participation in prayers, while adults were reminded of ethical conduct, piety, and propriety. Discipline extended beyond immediate infractions to include the shaping of character, the molding of behavior, in line with the workhouse's philosophy, and the cultivation of a submissive, compliant demeanor. The cumulative effect of inspections and rule enforcement was pervasive. Inmates became acutely aware of the gaze of authority, adjusting posture, speech, and action in anticipation. The presence of master and matron, coupled with the regular reading of rules, created an atmosphere in which deviation was minimized and conformity internalized. Even moments that might otherwise permit relaxation, personal thought, or expression were subtly constrained, governed by the knowledge that observation was continuous and authority absolute. These inspections and rules were not arbitrary, though they often appeared harsh. They reflected the Victorian philosophy that poverty and idleness were to be countered with discipline, moral instruction, and structured labor. Compliance was framed as both a moral obligation and a practical necessity. The workhouse existed to provide shelter, sustenance, and oversight, but always within boundaries designed to maintain order and prevent indulgence. The master and matron were both arbiters and enforcers, their authority exercised through meticulous attention to detail, careful observation, and the reinforcement of rules that structured every aspect of daily life. Even the smallest acts of compliance became markers of success. Beds arranged neatly, tools aligned correctly, work completed on time, or children sitting attentively in class, were subtle confirmations of the effectiveness of inspection and rule enforcement. Conversely, lapses served as reminders of both personal limitation and institutional authority. In this environment, the rhythm of life was inseparable from the rhythm of observation. Actions were continuously measured against the expectations of those in power, and the very act of existing within the workhouse entailed an unbroken engagement with rules, inspections, and moral discipline. Thus, inspections and rules functioned as both structure and instrument of control. They defined the parameters of acceptable behavior, regulated daily routines, and shaped the psychological landscape of the workhouse. Authority was ever present, communicated through glance, gesture, spoken word, and the unyielding standards of the institution. Life within the walls became a careful negotiation of compliance, endurance, and submission, with each day reinforcing the central lesson that order, discipline, and obedience were inseparable from survival. Within the shadowed corridors of the Victorian workhouse, set apart from the stone-floored dormitories and bustling workrooms, lay the hospital ward, a place of quiet, lingering illness and fragile human endurance. Unlike the regimented routine of labor, meals and schooling, the hospital ward existed in a slower, heavier rhythm, where time was measured in the rising and falling of fevers, the administration of basic remedies, and the careful observation of those deemed too weak or infirm to participate in the labor that defined the workhouse's purpose. It was here, among the sick, elderly and chronically ill, that the reality of deprivation, both physical and emotional, became most palpable. The air of the hospital ward was thick with the mingled scents of antiseptic, herbal infusions, and the faint, persistent odor of unwashed bodies. Medicine, often rudimentary by modern standards, was administered in the form of bitter tonics, powdered substances, or washes intended to alleviate symptoms rather than cure. Nurses, sometimes fellow inmates trained in basic care, sometimes appointed staff, moved quietly among the beds, their hands roughened by labor yet precise in measurement and administration. Touch was functional, devoid of intimacy. Comfort, when offered, was limited to the most essential acts of tending to the patient's immediate needs. Beds were arranged in rows, each one a small island of vulnerability, separated only by the narrow spaces necessary for movement and observation. Sheets, blankets and mattresses were coarse, often thin, and insufficient to ward off the damp chill of winter that penetrated stone walls. Patients, wrapped in worn blankets, lay with eyes half closed, faces pale and drawn, sometimes murmuring quietly, sometimes silent in resignation. The rhythm of breathing, coughing, and occasional movement was punctuated by the steps of nurses and the distant echo of the workhouse beyond, a constant reminder of the world continuing outside this fragile enclave. Illness within the workhouse ward was not merely physical, it carried a weight of isolation and quiet despair. Families had long since been separated upon admission, and even the companionship of fellow patients was minimal, constrained by space, rules, and the understanding that comfort, sympathy, and shared conversation were luxuries rarely permitted. The chronically ill and elderly faced long periods of waiting, sometimes days, for attention, their suffering measured as much by monotony and solitude as by fever, pain or weakness. Medical inspections were both routine and intrusive. Each patient was observed for signs of deterioration or infection. Temperature, pulse and visible symptoms were noted, often with little explanation or reassurance. Treatments were applied according to institutional guidelines, not individual preference, and patients learned quickly to endure discomfort without complaint. Fever, coughs and other ailments were met with prescribed remedies, often repetitive, and the perception of improvement was measured against strict standards rather than subjective well-being. The psychological weight of the hospital ward was accentuated by its sensory environment. The smell of medicine, combined with the damp chill, the faint moans of the sick, and the echoing footsteps of attendants, created a pervasive atmosphere of quiet suffering. Time moved differently here than in other parts of the workhouse. Hours stretched and contracted according to the rhythms of pain, observation and treatment, unmarked by labor, school, or regimented meals. Patients existed in a suspended reality, one that was physically taxing, emotionally draining, and monotonously slow. The elderly, often frail and weak, were particularly vulnerable. Stripped of autonomy and agency, they depended entirely upon the attentiveness of nurses for feeding, washing, and movement. Chronic illness, the accumulation of years of labor, and the general deprivation of life in the workhouse left them physically diminished and psychologically subdued. Their presence served as a constant reminder of the toll exacted by poverty, labor, and institutional life. Children who fell ill were similarly vulnerable, their small bodies subject to the same rules of observation and treatment. They lay quietly, their education interrupted, their labor deferred, their routine replaced by long hours of rest and the occasional ministrations of nurses. Even in illness, discipline and observation were maintained. Bedwetting, complaints or unrest were noted and corrected. The combination of physical suffering, isolation, and oversight created a unique, heavy rhythm that marked the slow passage of days. Despite the grim environment, the hospital ward also contained quiet acts of care, brief gestures of attention that alleviated suffering, however minimally. A nurse adjusting a blanket, checking a pulse or offering a small cup of weak tea could bring transient relief, though the underlying conditions of deprivation, monotony and lack of autonomy remained. Survival depended on endurance, compliance, and the patient's ability to accept both the limitations of treatment and the broader realities of workhouse life. Evenings in the hospital ward were particularly quiet, the distant sounds of the workhouse fading, leaving only the sighs, coughs, and occasional shuffles of the sick. The cold settled deeper into stone walls, blankets, and frail limbs, and the day's interventions concluded until morning inspection. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, fragmented, and measured against the discomfort of fever, the weight of blankets, and the chill of the environment. In this liminal space, time was stretched, life slowed, and the persistence of survival became an endurance of both body and spirit. Thus, the hospital ward embodied the most vulnerable and human aspects of the workhouse experience. It was a place where suffering, endurance, and observation converged, where the institution's philosophy of control, discipline, and provision intersected with the frailty and quiet despair of those least able to defend themselves. It was a stark reminder that life within the workhouse, even when shielded from labor and routine, remained constrained, harsh, and profoundly regulated. As winter gradually yielded to spring beyond the tall stone walls of the workhouse, the world outside began to stir with subtle signs of renewal. Buds emerged on bare branches, streams once locked in ice murmured faintly with the thaw, and birdsong, hesitant at first, began to punctuate the quiet of the surrounding town. Sunlight grew stronger, filtering in longer through frost-free windows, casting thin shafts of warmth across pavements and fields. Yet inside the workhouse, the rhythm of daily life remained largely unchanged. The seasons touched the world beyond only faintly, brushing against stone walls, narrow corridors, and the faces of inmates who were conditioned to measure time by labor, meals, and observation, rather than the bloom of flowers or the lengthening of days. The men in the stone yard continued their unrelenting work, lifting, striking, and breaking cobbles with the same steady, repetitive motions, though the chill of winter had eased, and the sunlight sometimes touched their shoulders as they bent over stone. Yet the brief caress of warmth was fleeting. The tasks themselves were unchanged, the overseer's presence unaltered, and the monotony of labor persisted. Even as the air outside carried the scent of thawing earth and new growth, the stone yard remained an enclosed, regulated expanse, insulated from the seasonal rhythms that marked life beyond the gates. Women in the laundry and other workrooms also felt the subtle difference of spring, though only indirectly. Windows, once heavily frosted, now admitted a softer light, illuminating the damp, steaming rooms with a muted brightness. The water in tubs remained cold, but the sun's warmth offered a fleeting comfort against the chill that lingered in stone floors and walls. Tasks, scrubbing, ironing, and folding, continued unceasingly, yet the shifting light and occasional whispers of birdsong filtering through high windows provided an almost imperceptible reminder of a world beyond the repetitive labor, a world moving to a different rhythm than that imposed by the workhouse. Children, too, noticed the change, though they were constrained by the same rigid routines of schooling, prayers, and labor. The longer days permitted slightly more sunlight to reach the classrooms, illuminating desks and lesson materials with a brightness absent in the grey winter months. Yet the lessons continued as before: catechism recitation, arithmetic drills, and rigid attention to detail. Any fleeting thoughts of emerging spring, buds, singing birds, or the warmth of sunlight on bare skin were absorbed quietly, filtered through the structures of discipline and expectation. Play remained minimal, confined to approved tasks or fleeting, supervised moments, so that the season's arrival was acknowledged primarily through visual cues rather than participation in the world outside. Meals, too, continued in their regulated fashion. Bread, gruel, and occasional vegetables marked the same rhythm of sustenance, unaffected by the turn of the seasons. The monotony of food, labor, and observation persisted, anchoring life inside the walls to a strict framework, largely impervious to the change outside. Even in the hospital ward, where illness and infirmity had slowed the passage of winter, the subtle increase in daylight filtered through narrow windows, offering quiet illumination for nurses and patients alike, but without fundamentally altering the slow, measured passage of time dictated by illness, care, and institutional control. The quiet persistence of routine highlighted the contrast between the world inside and the natural world beyond. While nature shifted, growing lighter, warmer, and more vibrant with each day, the workhouse remained insulated from seasonal celebration, pleasure, or freedom. Light in the windows changed, casting patterns on walls, floors, and faces, but these were the only markers of time's passage that inmates could reliably perceive. The monotony of work, the regularity of meals, and the scrutiny of inspections continued to dominate experience, rendering the arrival of spring almost abstract, an external fact more than a lived reality. Psychologically, the subtle signs of seasonal change were quietly influential. Sunlight falling across a desk, the distant sound of a bird's song, or the first hints of thaw in puddles outside walls provided a gentle reminder of life beyond the workhouse. For some, it may have stirred faint memories of freedom, home, or simpler pleasures. For others, the contrast could underscore the confinement and regulation of the institution, highlighting the unchanging routine that insulated them from the natural world. Yet, even these perceptions were brief, filtered through the demands of labor, obedience, and the structural rhythm of life inside. Evening rituals continued unchanged, with meals, brief periods of rest, and preparations for sleep following the same order as during winter. The long shadows of spring sunlight lengthened across stone floors, but the schedule remained regimented. Beds were made, tasks completed, and inspection ensured that order prevailed. In this sense, the workhouse existed in a separate temporal reality, one defined less by the movement of the sun, the bloom of flowers, or the song of birds, and more by the dictates of authority, discipline, and labor. Thus, the arrival of spring was both present and absent. Beyond the gates, life shifted, warmed, and renewed itself, yet within the workhouse, the rhythm of existence remained almost impervious to these natural changes. Only light and subtle warmth penetrated the walls, offering a quiet, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of time's passage. For inmates, the season's arrival was a visual and sensory whisper rather than an event to be celebrated, a muted marker of a world that continued outside while their lives remained tightly circumscribed within stone walls, rules, and routine. Amid the strict schedules of labor, meals, and instruction, religion occupied a significant enduring place within the rhythm of workhouse life. It was not merely a matter of personal belief or spiritual reflection. It was a structured instrument of discipline, moral education, and behavioral control, woven into the daily, weekly, and seasonal fabric of existence. For men, women, and children alike, prayers, hymns, and Sunday services provided rhythm, repetition, and a framework through which obedience, humility, and endurance were reinforced. Daily prayers punctuated the day. In the mornings, a subdued congregation of inmates might be gathered in a common hall or chapel, stone walls echoing faintly with the careful intonation of recited passages. Children were led through catechisms, memorizing biblical texts and moral instruction, their voices rising and falling in unison under the watchful eyes of a teacher or matron. Adults, too, were expected to participate in these quiet rituals, kneeling or sitting with proper posture, attentively following along, their lips moving in measured repetition. The act of prayer was both a personal moment and a public performance, reinforcing the values of compliance and attentiveness in equal measure. Hymns, when sung, were deliberate and structured, each verse repeated with precision and care. The melodies were simple, designed not for enjoyment, but for participation and memorization. Voices blended into a single orderly sound, each individual contributing to a communal act that emphasized unity, submission, and the shared acknowledgement of authority, both divine and institutional. Singing was controlled. Deviation from the prescribed pitch, pace, or timing could be noted and corrected, further reinforcing the omnipresence of oversight and expectation within every aspect of workhouse life. Sunday services were longer and slightly more formal. These occasions were among the few moments when inmates could assemble as a broader community. Yet even here, the experience was tightly regulated. Seating arrangements were predetermined, with men, women and children occupying separate areas. The sermon, often delivered by a visiting clergyman or the workhouse chaplain, emphasized moral conduct, industry, obedience, and the proper acceptance of one's social station. Illustrations of divine providence, punishment for sin, and the virtues of humility served as implicit reinforcement of the workhouse's philosophy. Compliance, endurance, and discipline were both morally virtuous and practically necessary. Religious instruction extended beyond the formal services. Reading of scriptures, recitation of prayers, and meditation on moral principles were expected throughout the day. Children might be required to memorize passages as part of schooling, while adults could be reminded to reflect quietly during moments of rest or labor. The repetition of religious texts, gestures, and songs became a quiet, constant rhythm, linking spiritual observance with the broader cycles of work, meals, and inspection. In this sense, religion functioned as both spiritual sustenance and practical reinforcement of institutional order. The physical spaces of worship within the workhouse, whether a small chapel, a repurposed hall, or a corner of a larger room, were austere. Stone floors, high windows, and minimal decoration emphasized solemnity and sobriety, reflecting the Victorian belief in moral simplicity and focus. Candles or small oil lamps provided illumination, their flickering light casting slow-moving shadows across walls, benches, and faces. The sensory environment, cool stone, faint candle scent, echoing voices, reinforced the meditative, disciplined nature of participation, reminding inmates that worship was both an obligation and a marker of proper conduct. Even for those less inclined towards spiritual reflection, religious routines structured the day and week. The expectation of attendance, participation, and attentiveness created predictability and continuity. Compliance with these routines signaled moral fitness, attention to authority, and alignment with institutional values. Conversely, inattention, misbehavior, or apparent lack of reverence could attract reprimand, adding another layer to the mechanisms of oversight that governed all aspects of life. For children, religion intertwined with education. Memorization of biblical texts, catechism recitation, and hymn practice were integrated into schooling, reinforcing obedience, attention, and the internalization of moral codes. Lessons were not limited to literacy or arithmetic. They included repeated, structured engagement with the ethical and spiritual expectations of society, as understood through the lens of Victorian institutional philosophy. Religion, therefore, served simultaneously as instruction, ritual, and psychological conditioning, shaping behavior and worldview from the earliest stages of life within the workhouse. Evenings often concluded with shorter prayers or reflections, marking the transition from labor and instruction to rest. The rhythm of kneeling, bowing, reciting, and listening provided a gentle closure to the day, reinforcing the continuity of routine and the ever-present moral framework imposed by authority. In the quiet moments following these rituals, inmates could briefly sense the passing of time in a structured way, the day segmented and marked by prayer, obedience, and ritualized attention to both spiritual and institutional expectations. Thus, religious routines within the workhouse exemplified the intersection of faith, structure, and control. They provided rhythm, moral instruction, and behavioral reinforcement, embedding obedience, attention, and endurance within both the physical and psychological landscape of daily life. The repetition of prayer, hymn, and scripture, in austere spaces under the watchful eyes of authority, created a continuous immersive framework, ensuring that even spiritual practice was inseparable from the wider rhythms and expectations of workhouse existence. Within the rigidly structured life of the Victorian workhouse, discipline was never an occasional necessity, but a constant, invisible presence. It existed not only in the explicit directives of the master or matron, but in the very architecture, schedule, and routine of the institution. Rules governed every action, from the arrangement of beds and the handling of tools to posture in classrooms and attention during prayers. Deviations, whether deliberate or accidental, were met with carefully calibrated punishments designed to correct behavior, reinforce obedience, and remind inmates of the ever-present authority under which they lived. Punishments took a variety of forms, each tailored to the nature of the infraction and the status of the individual. Minor lapses, such as a misaligned uniform, incomplete work, or inattentive posture, might result in additional labor, a small silent humiliation, or being required to repeat tasks under strict supervision. These small repetitive punishments reinforced attention to detail, obedience, and conformity, embedding the lesson that even minor infractions carried consequences. The effect was cumulative, creating a subtle psychological conditioning in which inmates continuously monitored their own behavior to avoid censure. More serious or repeated offenses could prompt loss of privileges, most commonly the reduction or withdrawal of meals. Bread, gruel, and other basic sustenance were not merely nutritional but instruments of behavioral control. Withholding food served as a tangible reminder of authority and the consequences of non-compliance, instilling a quiet fear that underscored the omnipresence of rules. Even the act of eating, ordinarily mundane, became a moment defined by hierarchy, obedience, and the awareness of institutional power. Confinement was another common method of enforcement. Inmates might be placed in small isolated rooms or cells for a period of time, cut off from the routine of labor, observation, and social contact. These periods of solitude were rarely comfortable. Stone floors, minimal bedding, and cold temperatures compounded the psychological weight of isolation. In confinement, time stretched slowly, marked only by the occasional steps of guards, the distant echoes of work outside, and the muted rhythms of institutional life. Isolation became an instrument of reflection and correction, emphasizing the consequences of deviation while limiting opportunity for distraction or resistance. Extra labor was perhaps the most visible form of punishment. Those deemed to have transgressed were often assigned additional tasks beyond the standard daily requirements: extended hours in the stone yard, extra scrubbing in the laundry, or additional work in kitchens or gardens. These punishments were both physically exhausting and psychologically reinforcing, linking the discomfort of exertion directly to the consequences of disobedience. The monotony of labor, combined with the heightened intensity of punitive work, created an immersive experience in which endurance and compliance became inseparable. Punishments were rarely accompanied by overt anger or dramatics. The philosophy of discipline within the workhouse was that correction should be consistent, impersonal, and predictable. Authority was conveyed through observation, structured enforcement, and routine rather than emotional expression. Inmates learned quickly that transgressions had consequences regardless of the intentions or temper of those in power. Compliance was expected as a matter of course, and the shadow of punishment loomed over every act, large or small. Children in particular were subject to a combination of moral and practical correction. Errors in lessons, inattentiveness in religious instruction, or minor breaches of conduct could result in additional schooling, enforced silence, or physical discomfort in confined spaces. The purpose was less to instill fear than to teach the consequences of action, reinforce obedience, and shape behavior in alignment with institutional values. Even small acts of disobedience were addressed meticulously, ensuring that the expectation of compliance became internalized early in life. The presence of authority figures reinforced this system constantly. The master, matron, and attendants moved through wards and workrooms with measured steps and watchful eyes, their observation alone serving as a preventative mechanism. Inmates became adept at self-regulation, adjusting posture, speech, and activity to align with expectations, knowing that deviation, however slight, could provoke correction. In this way, discipline extended beyond formal punishment to a pervasive, continuous conditioning, shaping behavior through anticipation as much as consequence. Punishment, therefore, was not merely reactive, but integrated into the very rhythm of workhouse life. The anticipation of censure influenced thought and action as much as the actual experience of extra labor, confinement, or loss of meals. Inmates learned to navigate the balance between endurance and compliance, constantly aware that the smallest infraction might elicit a response, and that survival, comfort, and minimal autonomy depended upon adherence to the ever-present rules. Even in moments of rest, the shadow of discipline lingered. Beds were arranged meticulously, chores completed promptly, and posture maintained during meals, prayers, and study. The expectation of inspection ensured that even the quietest activities were observed, reinforcing the omnipresence of authority. Punishment was thus both immediate and enduring, tangible in action and psychological in effect, shaping not only behavior, but perception, attention, and the very experience of daily life. Through the unrelenting combination of observation, correction, and structured routine, the workhouse instilled a deeply internalized understanding of authority, obedience, and consequence. Punishments were a continuous shadowy presence, not merely instruments of correction, but tools for molding behavior, reinforcing endurance, and sustaining the rigid social, moral, and operational order upon which the institution relied. Life within the workhouse was measured, disciplined, and constant, with the shadow of potential punishment casting a quiet, persistent influence over every waking moment. As the slow wheel of the year turned toward summer, the world beyond the workhouse walls became vibrant with heat, light, and growth, yet inside, life continued under the persistent rhythms of labor, meals, and observation, altered only subtly by the change in season. The arrival of summer brought longer days, the sunlight stretching through high windows, filtering into the stone corridors and workrooms, illuminating dust motes dancing in the warmth. The stone walls, cold and oppressive in winter, now absorbed the sun's intensity, radiating heat into dormitories, workrooms, and halls, creating a stifling atmosphere that made each hour of labor heavier, each task more taxing, and each step of the daily routine more noticeable in its difficulty. Men in the stone yard faced long hours under the sun, their shoulders taut, backs bent, and skin often reddened by exposure. Though the chill of winter was gone, it was replaced by the fatigue of heat, the slow dehydration from exertion, and the psychological weight of relentless work in the glare of sunlight. The monotonous tasks, breaking stones, picking oakum, and other forms of labor, remained unchanged, yet the physical burden was intensified by the warmth that seemed to press down from the walls, floors, and open sky alike. Shadows were longer and sharper, sweat traced slow lines across faces and necks, and the men learned to endure the interplay of sunlight, heat, and relentless labor with the same quiet submission demanded in colder months. Women in the laundry, or engaged in other domestic work, experienced the stifling heat more acutely. Tubs of water boiled with soap and steam, irons glowed with heat, and the constant scrubbing, folding, and laundering left the air thick with moisture and warmth. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching the steam in golden shafts, but offered no relief from the oppressive density of the air. Their work, repetitive and unending, now carried an added weight. Fatigue increased, patience waned, and the slightest lapse in attention could draw notice from matrons who moved through the rooms with the same precise observation as in colder months. Even the occasional fan or open window was insufficient to dissipate the combined intensity of physical exertion and summer heat, leaving the women to endure both labor and environment in tandem. Children, too, felt the effects of summer. Schooling continued under the same strict regimen of catechism, arithmetic, and moral instruction, yet the longer daylight hours and warmer air changed the physical and emotional texture of their experience. Classroom spaces became warmer, air heavier, and restlessness more noticeable. Even small movements, the shifting of posture, turning of a page, or whisper of a pen, became more pronounced in the quiet of study halls. Recess or minor permitted breaks offered only fleeting relief. Sunlight and warmth were present, yet freedom remained impossible, contained within the rigid schedules of learning, labor, and observation. Meals, while unchanged in composition, took on a different sensory character. The gruel, bread, and occasional vegetables and meat were served in warmer air, making the sparse fare feel heavier on the stomach. Water, though available, was often insufficient for full relief, leaving thirst as a quiet, persistent discomfort for all residents. Even in eating, summer exerted its influence. The heat of the room and the physical exertion of labor combined to make mealtime both a necessity and a burden, reminding inmates that survival was inseparable from the endurance of both body and environment. The hospital ward, too, bore the imprint of summer. Feverish patients, the elderly, and the infirm experienced the intensification of discomfort from the heat, their already fragile endurance tested by the warmth radiating from walls, sunlight through windows, and the concentrated air of close quarters. Nurses moved with deliberate care, administering remedies and adjusting blankets, aware that heat and exposure could exacerbate weakness or illness. The slow rhythm of time in the infirmary, measured by pulses, breath and observation, now included the subtle weight of environmental discomfort layered over the inherent suffering of sickness and infirmity. Summer in the workhouse highlighted the contrast between the vibrant world outside and the controlled environment inside. While fields and gardens thrived beyond the walls, filled with movement, light and the scent of growth, the inmates remained enclosed, subject to routines and labor that were unchanged in their intensity. The season's arrival brought no holidays, no extended play, no relief from observation or discipline. It offered only a subtle shift in sensory experience, a reminder of the world beyond that was seen, smelled and felt, but rarely touched or participated in. The psychological impact of summer was quiet but pervasive. Longer days and stronger sunlight created awareness of time, marking the slow progression of weeks and months in ways that winter's uniform grey could not. Yet this awareness existed alongside the unchanging structure of workhouse life, emphasizing endurance and compliance rather than enjoyment or reflection. Fatigue increased, patience waned, and the quiet hum of labor, meals and inspections became more physically demanding under the weight of seasonal heat. Evenings, though slightly longer in daylight, followed the same carefully ordered routine. Beds were arranged, chores completed, and inspections conducted, while the fading sun cast elongated shadows across floors and walls. The heat lingered in rooms and hallways, softening only gradually as night approached, leaving the sensation of warmth, weariness, and the enduring presence of rules and observation to mark the transition from day to rest. Sleep, when it came, was often fitful, disturbed by warmth, perspiration, and the memories of labor, yet necessary for endurance, resilience, and survival. Thus, summer in the workhouse was not a season of relief, but a subtle intensification of existing conditions. The heat emphasized the physical demands of labor, the endurance required of all residents, and the persistent rhythms of authority, observation, and discipline. Life continued in measured steps, the world outside blooming with freedom and growth, while those within remained constrained, enduring the interplay of seasonal change through the lens of survival, labor, and constant oversight. With the height of summer settling over the workhouse, the routines of children adjusted subtly, though the constraints of institutional life remained firmly in place. Where winter had confined them to classrooms, dormitories, and narrow corridors, the warmer months permitted brief excursions into the workhouse yards, areas enclosed by high stone walls and iron gates, where the sun shone down onto gravel, dirt, and worn flagstones. These outdoor moments, while limited in duration and heavily supervised, offered a semblance of freedom, a fleeting taste of open air, sunlight, and physical movement that contrasted sharply with the rigid interior life of lessons, prayers, and labor. The yards themselves were austere and functional, designed not for play but for control and exercise. Gravel paths, worn patches of grass, and occasional trees provided a modest environment, but every step was observed, every action noted by attendants or matrons stationed strategically around the perimeter. Children gathered in small groups, often divided by age or gender, their movements measured against the rules of decorum. Even in moments of running, skipping or simple games, restraint was required. Shouting, touching or wandering beyond marked areas was prohibited, and any deviation could provoke swift correction. Play was constrained by time as well as space. A designated period in the late morning or early afternoon allowed children to leave classrooms or dormitories for fresh air, but these periods were brief, sometimes as short as 20 or 30 minutes, leaving little opportunity for extended games or exploration. Within these parameters, children improvised, inventing games that required minimal movement, used objects at hand or engaged in quiet competitions, laughter and voices modulated by both habit and instruction. The freedom of outdoor play existed, paradoxically within strict limits that both enabled and suppressed expression. The sensory experience of summer in the yards was vivid against the backdrop of an enclosed life. Sunlight warmed bare shoulders, brushed hair, and illuminated faces that had spent the majority of the day indoors. The air carried the faint scent of grass, soil and warming stone, providing subtle reminders of the world beyond. Sounds too were a rare indulgence, The soft patter of feet, occasional whispers of conversation, and restrained laughter punctuated the otherwise quiet, ordered environment. Even the brightest moments were mediated by the institutional gaze, making freedom a fleeting impression rather than a sustained experience. The psychological significance of these outdoor moments was nuanced. Children experienced relief from the monotony of classrooms and dormitories, a brief outlet for energy and expression, yet they were also acutely aware of the limitations imposed upon them. The constant supervision, the structured boundaries, and the implicit knowledge that punishment awaited any misstep. Play was both joy and caution, a reminder of physical possibility constrained by social and institutional control. Through these moments, children learned early the negotiation of personal desire against imposed authority, internalizing the rhythms of compliance even in times designed for leisure. Even the physical exertion of play was affected by summer heat. Gravel paths radiated warmth, flagstones pressed against bare feet, and the sun hung heavy overhead. Sweaty foreheads, flushed cheeks, and labored breathing were ordinary, yet these signs of vitality were monitored as carefully as any lesson or chore. The workhouse's ethos of endurance extended into these moments. Physical activity, while permitted for brief periods, was observed, managed, and integrated into the broader expectations of compliance and self-regulation. In addition to informal games, structured exercises occasionally took place. Attendants might lead stretches, marches, or other mild physical activities, intended to maintain health, reinforce discipline, or demonstrate control over the children's bodies. These exercises, though less formal than labor or schooling, were nevertheless another mechanism through which authority and routine were reinforced. Even movement for pleasure was inseparable from observation and regulation, ensuring that the summer air offered no unmonitored liberty. Meals, still monotonous in composition, bread, gruel, occasional meat or vegetables, took on a different character as the year progressed. The air within halls and dining areas grew cooler, making hot gruel and weak tea comforting in a faint, functional sense. Yet the contrast between the harvest abundance outside and the meager, unchanging fare inside was stark. While villagers beyond the walls celebrated the collection of crops, storage of food, and preparation for winter, the workhouse remained insulated from such seasonal relief. Scarcity and uniformity defined daily sustenance, underscoring the separation between institution and surrounding society. The hospital wards similarly reflected autumn's subtle influence. Patients, elderly and infirm, experienced cooler, damper air filtering through narrow windows, sometimes exacerbating aches, chills, or discomfort. Nurses adjusted blankets, heated water, and attended to patients with quiet diligence, aware that even minor shifts in temperature could influence well-being. Yet the overall rhythm of care, inspection, cleaning, administering remedies, and monitoring remained constant, showing how environmental change interacted minimally with the structure of institutional life. Psychologically, autumn highlighted the passage of time. The movement from summer to fall brought shadows lengthening earlier in the evening, cooler air that reminded the body of mortality and endurance, and visual cues of life cycles beyond the walls. Yet within the workhouse, these shifts were absorbed into the existing framework of discipline, observation, and routine. The sensory reminders of the world outside, rustling leaves, harvest activity, the smell of plowed earth, were noted but not engaged with. The contrast emphasized the insularity of the institution, where the natural progression of time existed as muted observation rather than lived experience. Religious and educational routines continued unaltered. Daily prayers, catechism, and labor were punctuated by inspection, the same careful enforcement of order, and the constant reminder that personal desire or distraction was subordinate to institutional expectation. Even as the world outside experienced abundance, color, and sensory richness, the workhouse environment remained monochrome in its continuity, light, labor, and time measured in obedience, rather than engagement with the natural world. As evenings approached, the workhouse adapted slightly to the cooler season. Fires or stoves were lit where available, thin blankets arranged, and dormitories prepared for the coming chill. Yet the overarching structure remained unchanged. Meals, rest, labor, and inspection defined life's rhythm. The passing of days, now increasingly marked by shorter light and longer nights, brought both physical and psychological adaptation, emphasizing endurance, resilience, and compliance over comfort, pleasure, or interaction with the cycles of the wider world. Thus, autumn in the workhouse existed as a quiet interlude, a season of muted transformation, noticed primarily through subtle shifts in light, temperature, and sensory experience. The natural abundance and change of the outside world contrasted sharply with the insistent uniformity of life within. Work continued, meals were consumed, prayers recited, and inspections carried out. The changing season was observed, felt, and endured, but it altered nothing fundamental in the regulated, enclosed, and meticulously ordered existence of the inmates. As the year crept toward its final months and winter's chill began to assert itself, the hospital ward of the workhouse quietly grew fuller, and with the colder air came the inevitable increase in illness, weakness, and mortality. The infirmary, always a place of subdued activity, became heavier, with the weight of bodies failing under the dual pressures of age, malnutrition, and the relentless labor that had marked the lives of the workhouse's residents. Those who had endured the year's seasons, summer heat, autumn's damp chill, and the harsh demands of constant work, often arrived in the ward weakened, their endurance stretched to its limits. The smells of the infirmary were pronounced in these months. Damp stone walls, mingled with the scent of unwashed linens, herbal remedies, and the occasional medicinal concoction, created an atmosphere at once antiseptic and oppressive. Nurses, attendants, and sometimes volunteers moved quietly among the beds, attending to the feverish, the elderly, and those whose bodies had succumbed to chronic ailments or sudden illness. Each movement was careful and methodical, blankets adjusted, water offered, poultices applied, and wounds cleaned. Yet, despite diligence, the underlying reality of mortality in the workhouse remained constant. Life here was fragile, precarious, and measured against the limits imposed by both the human body and institutional constraint. Paupers' deaths were frequent, yet always quiet. The passing of an individual was acknowledged with minimal ceremony, reflecting the practical, austere philosophy of the institution. Funerals, when they occurred, were simple and subdued. A small procession, often limited to workhouse staff, and the transportation of the body to the pauper's grave. These graves, usually in communal plots beyond the workhouse walls, were prepared in advance, a silent testament to the transience of life within the institution. Markers, if present, were modest. Memory was left to the collective rather than to individual recognition. Death, while sorrowful, was woven into the rhythm of workhouse life as a routine inevitability, both expected and quietly absorbed. The emotional atmosphere in the ward was muted, a blend of resignation, observation, and constrained empathy. Fellow inmates, aware of the severity of illness, maintained a quiet attentiveness, their own behavior tempered by the ever-present rules of order and compliance. Expressions of grief, if permitted, were restrained, and the focus remained on the immediate necessities of care and routine. In this environment, even the most intimate human experiences, sickness, fear, dying, were filtered through the lens of institutional control, emphasizing endurance, quiet observation, and the suppression of personal indulgence. Seasons exacerbated these conditions. Autumn's dampness, winter's chill, and limited heating created an environment in which respiratory illnesses, fever, and other chronic conditions flourished. Nutritional scarcity, coupled with labor-related fatigue, further weakened residents, making them more susceptible to disease and increasing the frequency of hospital admissions. In this way, the natural environment and institutional constraints combined to heighten vulnerability, and the infirmary became a mirror of mortality, endurance, and institutional pragmatism. Care in the hospital was functional, measured, and structured. Nurses administered remedies, according to prescribed routines, noting symptoms, adjusting blankets, and monitoring vital signs, yet their capacity was limited by both personnel and the philosophy of the workhouse. Resources were allocated with careful attention to the majority, and individual comfort was often subordinate to efficiency. Despite the austere care, the presence of attentive hands and methodical action offered a quiet form of relief, a predictable rhythm in an environment where uncertainty was otherwise constant. Funerals and burials reflected the intersection of social hierarchy and institutional economy. A pauper's grave was prepared with minimal ceremonial trappings, a wooden coffin or simple shroud, a muted procession, and the assignment of laborers to dig and fill the grave. There were no extended family gatherings, no communal mourning, and little recognition beyond the immediate staff of the workhouse. In this, death became a final act of regulation, integrated seamlessly into the broader cycles of labor, observation, and survival that governed life within the walls. Even for those who survived illness, the experience was transformative. Bodies weakened by infirmity, lungs taxed by chill, and limbs stiffened by lack of nourishment or work-related injury created an enduring imprint of suffering. Recovering individuals returned to the same routines of labor, meals, and obedience, carrying with them the memory of fragility, endurance, and the constant presence of mortality. This continuity ensured that life, work, and observation continued in parallel with the quiet, inevitable rhythm of death. Through autumn and into winter, the hospital ward thus served as a quiet stage upon which the limits of endurance were made tangible. The infirm and dying, while treated with measured care, were reminders of human vulnerability within a system designed for survival, order, and efficiency. Death was neither sensationalized nor ignored. It existed as an understated, inevitable, and omnipresent aspect of workhouse life, shaping perception, behavior, and understanding of one's place within the institution. As the year drew toward its close and winter wrapped the workhouse in cold stone and narrow shafts of light, the calendar brought a rare muted deviation from the otherwise rigidly controlled rhythms of life. Christmas, unlike the vibrant celebrations outside the walls, illuminated by candlelight, filled with laughter, music, and the scent of baked goods, the workhouse offered only subdued acknowledgments of the season, measured gestures that suggested festivity without loosening the iron grip of routine. The high stone walls remained unchanged, enclosing a world of labor, meals, and observation. Yet within this continuity, a subtle shift occurred, perceptible in small details and quiet atmospheres. Meals during this time were perhaps marginally improved, an occasional addition to the standard fare that momentarily punctuated monotony, where gruel, coarse bread, and thin soup typically dominated. A small portion of meat, a pudding, or a rare sweet could appear on plates, offering a fleeting sensory delight. Even these minor luxuries were dispensed with careful economy, designed less to indulge than to mark an occasion, while preserving the underlying principles of austerity and control. In the dining hall, long tables were lined with inmates sitting in prescribed order, utensils arranged precisely, and silence observed. The enhanced meal experienced not as freedom, but as a temporary, contained variation in the ongoing pattern of survival. Religious rituals carried particular significance during Christmas. Hymns were sung, short, structured, and familiar, filling halls with carefully measured sound. The readings and prayers, emphasizing gratitude, humility, and moral instruction, reinforced the ethos of obedience while providing a sensory shift from the monotony of ordinary days. Children, seated in rows or small groups, absorbed lessons of charity, virtue, and piety, their participation structured and observed. Even moments of spiritual engagement were bound by institutional oversight, transforming the celebration into a reflection of order and continuity, rather than unbridled expression. A few small gestures of kindness occasionally punctuated the day. Staff might distribute extra blankets, allow slightly extended outdoor time, or engage in brief, quiet conversation beyond the typical formalities. For a fleeting moment, residents could experience warmth and human attentiveness that differed from the habitual tone of surveillance and correction. Yet these gestures, though perceptible, were fleeting, controlled, and carefully circumscribed, reminding inhabitants that even charity and relief existed within the hierarchy and rules of the workhouse. The physical environment itself reinforced the sense of continuity. Stone corridors, high walls, and narrow windows retained their austere character. Dormitories were arranged in identical rows, beds made according to strict order, and the air retained its chill, heavy with winter and damp stone. Light from candles or small fires flickered gently, but could not transform the elemental harshness of stone and schedule. The world outside, with its laughter, music, and illumination, remained inaccessible, glimpsed through windows or noted in faint sounds, yet entirely separate from the contained rituals of the workhouse. For children, Christmas provided an unusual muted interlude. In addition to hymns, minor privileges, a small treat, a token decoration, or the opportunity for brief supervised play, offered moments of sensory and emotional relief. Laughter, whispers, and soft excitement might ripple through the halls, yet always under observation, contained by routine, and framed by the understanding that any deviation from expectation could elicit correction. The fleeting warmth of communal enjoyment contrasted with the prevailing message of endurance and compliance, creating an experience simultaneously celebratory and disciplined. Evenings remained ordered. After the brief deviations for meal and ritual, residents returned to dormitories or workrooms, inspected and arranged according to usual standards. Sleep followed the same regulated schedule, the warmth of shared space tempered by the lingering chill of stone and winter air. In these hours, the temporary shift in atmosphere faded, and the workhouse returned to its enduring rhythm: labor, meals, discipline, observation, and endurance. Thus, Christmas in the workhouse existed as a paradoxical moment, a rare nod toward festivity and human warmth, yet inseparable from the overarching system of control and order. Slight improvements in meals, hymns, and small gestures of kindness offered sensory and emotional variation, but the boundaries of routine, authority, and institutional enclosure remained firmly intact. Inhabitants experienced Christmas not as liberation, but as a subtle acknowledgement of tradition and humanity within a world otherwise defined by labor, discipline, and endurance. As the calendar turned once more to January, the workhouse resumed its unbroken rhythm, returning to the familiar patterns of labor, meals, observation, and endurance that had defined the year. Outside, winter's chill settled into stone walls and narrow windows, frost clung to the ground, and the muted light of short days cast long grey shadows along corridors and dormitories. The gates remained closed, the ironwork cold and unyielding, a silent reminder of enclosure and separation from the world beyond. For the residents, the passage of months had changed little in terms of daily routine. The repetition of tasks, the regulation of meals, the inspection of bodies and behavior, and the quiet enforcement of rules continued without interruption, reinforcing the workhouse as both home and prison, shelter and instrument of control. Men returned to the stone yard with the same measured movements, shoulders bent under labor, hands roughened by endless repetition. The cold seeped into skin and bones, emphasizing the harshness of work and the relentless passage of time. Oakum picking, stone breaking, and other tasks were unchanged by season, yet the physical environment intensified their experience, reminding men of both the endurance required and the impossibility of reprieve. Each day followed the same rigid schedule: rising before dawn, labor under watchful eyes, brief meals in silence, and evenings in dormitories, arranged with unyielding order. Women resumed their domestic duties with equal rigor. Laundry, scrubbing, sewing, and cleaning persisted under the watchful presence of matrons, who ensured that silence, propriety, and obedience were maintained. Winter brought the additional discomfort of cold floors, damp corridors, and heavier clothing, amplifying the physical demands of labor. The warmth of steaming tubs offered only temporary relief, and the rhythm of repetitive work emphasized the continuity of endurance required across seasons. Small gestures of kindness from previous occasions, such as Christmas, had faded into memory, leaving only the structure, expectation, and observation that defined daily existence. Children returned to classrooms, dormitories, and brief outdoor periods with a renewed sense of constraint. Lessons continued in rote memorization, catechism, and moral instruction, the discipline of schooling unaltered by the passing of months. Even outdoor play, permitted briefly during warmer months, was now limited and cold, constrained further by frost and shorter daylight. The sensory and psychological markers of seasonal change were present, but tempered by routine. The world outside remained a distant, muted reality, glimpsed through windows and fences yet never fully experienced. Meals, too, resumed their austere consistency: gruel, bread, potatoes, and the occasional portion of meat or soup returned as the constants of sustenance, the repetition a reminder of scarcity and endurance. Water was available but not abundant, warmth minimal, and sensory relief slight. The contrast with the abundance observed beyond the walls, the vibrant produce of the surrounding countryside, the activity of families and neighbours, was sharp, emphasizing the separation between workhouse life and the broader rhythms of human experience. The hospital ward, accommodating the sick, elderly, and infirm, reflected the cumulative impact of a year of labour, season, and endurance. Bodies weakened by chronic illness or seasonal susceptibility were met with methodical care, yet the constraints of resources and institutional priorities ensured that attention remained measured and functional. Deaths continued quietly, funerals conducted with minimal ceremony, and the communal paupers' graves awaited the inevitable. Life and mortality intertwined seamlessly, a constant presence shaping perception, endurance, and understanding of one's place within the workhouse. Even religious routines persisted without alteration. Daily prayers, hymns, and Sunday services continued to provide structure, moral instruction, and measured moments of sensory variation, yet remained firmly embedded within the broader framework of observation and control. The cycle of labor, meals, inspection, and sleep unfolded once more with predictable rhythm, underscoring the continuity of life within the institution and the unchanging nature of authority. The psychological landscape mirrored the physical and procedural realities. Residents were acutely aware that the workhouse functioned as both environment and system. Seasons changed, bodies aged, and brief diversions occurred, yet the overarching cycle remained unbroken. Time was measured in labor, meals, and observation rather than personal accomplishment or freedom. Even the memory of holidays, outdoor play, or rare indulgences existed as faint echoes against the dominant presence of order and regulation. As January deepened, the quiet repetition of routines reinforced the sense of enclosure. Gates remained locked, walls unyielding, and corridors lined with the familiar sights and sounds of life constrained by structure. The world beyond, the vibrant streets, distant fields, and unconfined lives, was observed only from a distance, providing context but never access. For all within the workhouse, the year had begun anew, not with liberation or change, but with the continuation of enduring patterns, a measured perpetuation of survival within walls designed to contain, discipline, and regulate. Thus, the cycle of workhouse life completed itself, returning to the point from which it began, the silent gates of January, cold stone walls, and the unbroken rhythm of poverty, labor, observation, and endurance. Life within the institution was not static, yet neither did it progress in the sense of personal freedom or escape. Each day, week, and season existed as both challenge and structure, repetition and continuity, encapsulating a world in which survival, compliance, and observation were inseparable, and where the passage of a year was marked less by external change than by the quiet endurance of those contained within. In this way, the workhouse existed as a self-contained ecosystem, cyclical and relentless, offering shelter at the cost of freedom, and shaping lives in accordance with the rigid expectations of an institution that measured human existence in the currency of labor, compliance, and resilience.